presentation. So I will now turn the floor to our final speaker, Dr. Rafal Rohozinski.
Great, and as I wait to see whether or not I'm going to be able to project on the screen as I am, I'm going to pick up on the last speaker's theme of WMDs and explain why it is that I'm using the slide that should be appearing here any moment. Years ago in the mid-1980s, I spent some time with the with the U.S. military, and I was put on an intriguing course that was called Placement of Small Atomic Demolition Munitions. There's a story behind that, but the punchline was that the manual that we were given was a comic book that showed us in pictures how these weapons worked and how they could be placed in order to have physics effects. At first I laughed when I saw it, but years later, what I remember is the comic book and not the formulas that are gave us. Though there is a method to the madness of showing you something complex in pictures so that the visual imagery triggers the kind of thinking that goes behind it. Now, I'd like to ask in the room here, how many of you are under the age of 35? Some of you are lying. How many of you use social media? Okay, so in both cases, we have less than half the room. It puts the rest of you into a global minority. The reality is that in the last 10 years, the concept of cyberspace and the usage of it has surged in a way that no other socio-technical system has. If I stood before you even 10 years ago and used the word cyberspace in front of General Leslie, probably only the pimply-faced kid in the back who happens to be running the mics would say, hey, I remember that from science fiction. And yet here we are at a meeting that includes former and serving military and NATO people talking about this as if it was a real space. Now, before I came here today, I was driving my car. I took a cell phone call that happened to come through Skype from somebody that I knew in Tajikistan. They told me about a PayPal account that they needed replenished because of things that they were buying from an online provider in Russia. Okay? That, to me, was completely normal. And yet, if I look back even 5 years ago, that would not be normal. We have grown so accustomed to transactions that we do online that they've become indelibly linked to our everyday lives. And in this talk, I want to step back a little bit from the nitty-gritty of the Stuxnet problem or the viruses that are going to take us down and sort of look at this space that we have created, the socio-technical space that we created about cyberspace, in order to think about how should we look at it from a strategic point of view. Now, a little over a month ago, Secretary Panetta raised exactly the same question in a speech that he gave. He said, we live in a highly complex, interconnected world where we've become dependent on a technology and a technical system that few of us understand, much less understand the depth of vulnerability that we have it. What would happen if all of a sudden, one day, the system would go away? How do we need to change our thinking at a strategic level to recognize the centrality of the system to our social, political, economic systems? And this is really what I want to take you on a journey on in the next 20 or so minutes. So the one thing that we need to recognize is that there has been an extraordinary surge in progress that is being brought about by the emergence of cyberspace. And this system that you see in front of you, visualized in space in terms of the electric grid, is almost entirely dependent on these systems that we've created. And these are complex and interdependent systems. Now, in some respects, the way that they've become manifested, or that we can see, is in two dimensions. One, what they have added to our economic systems, and secondly, how we actually use them in our societies. So this is an interesting little graph that was based upon a study that was done by a World Bank economist in the 1980s, or looking up to date into 1990, that looked at the role of science and technology as a factor of driving economies. So he wanted to know, look, all other things being equal, human capital being equal, natural resources being equal, to what extent is development and economic growth based upon the ability to harness science and technology for industrial production. So we looked at two countries, which in 1958 had the same level of development, Ghana and South Korea, but which by 1990 had this incredible divergence in terms of their economic growth. Now, what he found was that everything underneath the purple line could be described as changes in human capital. In other words, more people doing more things within an economy. Everything above the purple line was the ability of the society to be able to harness science and technology as a factor of production. Now, if this trajectory line was true when institutions were the principal drivers of economic growth up to 1990, one of the chief differences past 1990, as we start entering into the cyber era, is the ability to take science and technology as a factor of production devolves to the individual, which means the steepness of this curve actually ends up getting much, much higher. So on an economic level, that's really the principal way in which cyber has transformed and has embedded itself into the very organism of our economic systems. Now, there's also another dimension to cyber which we sometimes forget. Cyberspace, and in particular the emergence of the internet, broke the former monopoly that nation states had on the free flow of information across state boundaries. It broke the telecom model, which gave the power to telecommunications carriers and broadcast agencies to determine who could call who and what content could be broadcast to whom. This was a phenomenally important event, which happened, I would say, by historical circumstance. Technology was emerging rapidly at the same time as institutions were falling down, the fall of the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War, where all of a sudden it was possible to do things across boundaries without being stuck in the same kind of stated system that occurred and it had engaged since 1945 up till 1990. Now that, to some extent, led, I think, if we look at it now in retrospect, to probably the largest single empowerment of individuals that we have seen since the Gutenberg Press. It made individuals have the ability at very low cost to access information and to communicate with people on a global level. It stripped away the kinds of monopolistic controls that authoritarian states previously held through a dominance of the communications regime. But after 2 decades of largely unfettered growth, this line of empowerment is being contested. We're now starting to see both states demanding the creation of digital borders, in some respects to guard against the kinds of insecurities in cyberspace that viruses call, but in large part also to contain their populations and strip away this ability of freedom of access. The freedom of navigation in cyberspace, which we've grown used to over the last 2 decades, is, in large measure, at risk. Now, as a result, we face a very interesting constitutive moment, whether cyberspace will remain an open domain, which brings both benefits to us as economies, as well as an empowering function to individuals, or whether it'll increasingly become cantonized among corporate and national lines, securitized by states for a variety of reasons, including fear of subversion or fear of revolution. So, to understand exactly how cyberspace is changing, I want to demystify a couple of issues about it by talking about 5 drivers of change, or 5 tendencies of change, which underpin much of what we think about when we talk about cybersecurity. I'm going to talk a little bit about technological change, demographical change, the problem of cybercrime, the emergence of cyberspace as a political domain, and finally, its emergence as a military domain. So the first driver of change, which is really being responsible for much of what we're seeing, has been the exponential growth of technology, which outpaces to a large extent the ability of regulators and policymakers to think proactively. And there's really 2 major things here that we need to look about. One is the Moore's Law. What that simply means is that technology has exponentially increased in capability, doubling every 18 months. So my iPhone 5 here, which I just bought about a month ago, currently has more capability than my laptop did even a year and a half ago. Okay? What that means is that supercomputing possibilities, which previously required millions of dollars in state institutions, can now be bought on a consumer level at about $300. Secondly, and linked to that, has been the fact that these devices have become mobile. And I'll talk about that in a while. But that mobility also implies the emergence of cloud computing. Now, cloud computing means that rather than me having to own a huge data center in order to crunch the kinds of volumes of information that I need to enhance my business, I can rent these things by an hour. Moreover, I can rent them by the hour from anywhere on the planet. So I don't have to be bound by physical resources of geography in order to, in effect, on the fly, create the kinds of computing capabilities which only a decade and a half ago could only be run by the NSA. Mobile technologies has changed that, by and large because of the fact that now this can be accessed from anywhere, by anyone, at any time. Now, if these things are shaping the technological environment of cyberspace, the other thing that's changing rapidly is the fact that we're shortly going to be entering into something called the Internet of Things. So up to now, me, my device, were always linked together and limited to a certain extent by the amount of address space, crudely speaking, that was available to create those things. In the next 2 or 3 years, the ability to give everything the ability to communicate to each other will become exponential. And I'll explain this. Up to now, what could exist in cyberspace was limited by something called IP addresses. And this is roughly the number of IP addresses that we've had to live with up to now. So beyond that, creating devices that had an individual address that could communicate and identify themselves looked like that. Now, there's a reason why this looks like a golf ball, because in the coming year, with a change in address scheme, this will be the number of addresses that's actually available to things. That means that everything from you, your dog collar, your pen, and everything else will have an address in cyberspace, and it will talk, and it will generate data, and that data will be harnessed by someone, and it'll be used by some kind of purpose. That creates tremendous opportunity, but it also creates tremendous risk. Cumulatively, what this means is that this combination of powerful computing, accessible mobilely from across the planet, at a scalable rate of power, means that the creation of technologies become generative. I no longer have to be in an institution. I no longer have to have fixed resources. I can actually create technology on the fly in the ether. Now, if we look at that technical environment, that technical soup that I've described, what makes this technical soup have power and meaning socially, economically, and for security purposes is another very important factor. And that is not what is cyberspace, but who is cyberspace. So from a broad term, currently about half of all humanity is connected to the kind of internet that you and I exist and benefit from here in Canada, what's known as broadband access, multimedia rich. There are, however, more cell devices in the world than there are people at the moment. And approximately 2/3 of all humanity is connected to cyberspace through a cell phone of one way or the other. Of those, 2/3 are under the age of 35 and 50% are in the age of 25. What does that tell you? That tells you that those people who are currently entering and live in cyberspace as their natural domain are those who are just entering into the most productive years of their life. For them, cyberspace represents a means for being able to access resources, to express agency in a way that for older generations simply wasn't necessarily the norm. Now, another statistic. United States and North America represents 11% of the global internet population. The Euro-Atlantic Alliance represents about 35% and declining. The center of gravity of cyberspace is shifting to the south and to the east, to Asia and to the developing world. Now, if we assume that the ethos of what has described cyberspace up to now has come from a largely North American culture focused around Silicon Valley, what happens when motivation, innovation, and the center of gravity shifts to the south and to the east? So this is the face of the new digital natives. Look into it, because this is where innovation is coming from. It's also interesting, and partially scary, that currently 3 out of 5 new internet users come from countries that are considered to be either fragile or failing, which means motivation for change meets technology, means disruption. For these people, cyberspace is not what it was for those of you weaned on Xboxes. I'm talking to only the people who were truthful about being under the age of 25. For them, cyberspace is a real means for accessing resources otherwise denied to them in real life. And that is an important fact to bear in mind, because if we look for the reasons behind what is currently driving what we see as the tsunami of cybercrime, well, that's where it's coming from. And I can give you a lot of statistics, but I won't. I'll just give you one. 2 years ago, we did a study with Bell Canada looking at the volume of what you might call bad traffic on Canada's backbone networks. We examined 839 petabytes. What we found was that between 20 and 30% of all traffic is considered to be traffic that is bad, either denial of service attacks, malware, spam, etc. Moreover, this is for you Government of Canada employees, out of 45 billion emails sent monthly from the .gcca domain, 44 billion were spam, which means that the insecurity of government networks used as a staging ground for cybercrime was disproportionately larger than any other sector of the economy itself. But if you really want to understand why we see this tsunami of cybercrime online, I'll put it to you in blunt terms. It's a lot less risky to commit a victimless crime, stealing your money from your bank here in Canada, than it is to fight over a fistful of rubles in the back alleyways of Ekaterinburg. And if we want to know why cybercrime is emanating mostly from the south and the east, it's for that reason. And the motivation is that clever youth and transnational gangs have become the newly empowered cyber underclass, who have the incentive to motivate fearlessly and redefine cyberspace in their interests. Now, I could talk a little bit more about cyber espionage, which I think is important, but I'll leave that to question and answers, because most of the innovation that comes into cyber espionage comes from what can be bought on the open market of cybercrime. Even Stuxnet, which was relatively sophisticated, can be described as a Frankenstein amalgam of the best practice in cybercrime. In fact, one of the reasons why it was detected was specifically because of those signatures that were embedded into it. I would also make one point for the record. We conducted several cyber espionage investigations, including one called GhostNet, which I won't go into a lot of detail in this talk. And I can tell you in 100% certainty that in each of the cyber espionage investigations that we looked at, we were able to get attribution down to the level of the individual that was responsible. Now, we did that using quite a bit of resources, which means that to scale that on an everyday basis would require possibly resources larger than are available even to some of our agencies that are tasked with that. But what I would say, without a doubt, is that the problem of attribution is one that we've constructed because of legal and policy constraints, and not one because of the practicality of doing it. Now, crime is not the only way in which this network empowerment has affected society. Cyberspace is also transforming politics. And as basically more of us go globally online, so too is politics. The confluence of technology, demographics, and need has brought about an empowerment and enlightenment such as the Arab Spring. But it's also made possible the lawless criminality that we saw in London 2 years ago. And it's also forcing us to reconsider some important constitutive factors, such as whether activities online we are now seeing have a precedent in earlier forms of rights under the legal code. So for example, the right to strike in Canada, the right of labor to picket its place of work such that people can't cross into that flow of work, only became a right in the 1920s and 30s here in Canada. Now, if I look at this, what does this represent? Well, this is a denial of service to a bricks and mortar institution. We protect that under the codes in Canada as a legally conducted right. Now, fast forward and imagine that my business only exists online and that my employees have a grievance against me. Should they not be able to also deny access to that business as part of their labor dispute? Under the criminal code, a denial of service attack is considered a criminal act. Now, I'm not advocating that we should decriminalize denial of service attacks, but what I am saying is that there are problems in that as more of our societies go online, we haven't fully thought through how the rights and freedoms, the social contract written between citizen and state, applies in this new domain of operation. And this also extends, for example, to access to information. We have long protected the right of journalists to do investigative reporting. However, when it's not a journalist doing it, when it's a crowdsourced mechanism of doing it, we see it as a criminalized act. Now, a consciousness of these challenges has meant that in the last 5 or 6 years, there's a growing number of states that have not sat by and idly ceded the social and political states to these newly empowered movements. In fact, moves to regulate or contain cyberspace within national boundaries have becoming aggressive and ever increasing. If you live in the Middle East, this is what you're more likely to see when you're trying to access a news source that the government doesn't want you to see. In fact, putting in place borders in cyberspace has become the norm. Now, this ends at 2009, but currently there are about 70 countries in the world that have created national legislation around borders in cyberspace. From a demographic point of view, it means that out of the 2.5 billion people that are currently connected in broadband, about 1.2 billion live in states where they are either legally or extra-legally forbidden to access certain kinds of content. And in fact, our own research has shown that as states become more aggressive, using what we've called second and third generation techniques to control access, implementing harsh legislation, regulating content control, making it subject to media laws and content laws, they've moved into a much more aggressive stance that in many ways starts to mimic the kinds of tools that are used by cyber criminals and others. Using hacking operations, for example, against political parties, 50-cent armies in order to counter-blog against messaging, etc. They've also adopted, interestingly enough, Facebook-like techniques in terms of identifying opposition people in real space. So this is a front page of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Cyber Command, where they effectively have used a crowdsourced mechanism, much like the police in Vancouver, to take pictures of opposition people in the streets and say, do you know this person? When a person is identified and jailed, they will advertise. We found out who he was, jailed. The effect is a tremendous chilling effect for anyone involved in opposition activity for fear of being identified and consequently jailed itself. Now, militarization of cyberspace. Inevitably, because of the importance of this complex interconnected infrastructure to socio-economic and political life, it has become the subject and the object of thinking around how it can be applied as a legitimate use for force projection. Now, in some parts, particularly in NATO countries, I think that recognition has come largely because of our own perceived vulnerability and dependence on these systems. Think about how dependent we have become on GPS, supply chains, more traditional command and control, and there's little doubt why cyber defense has become a major issue. But interestingly, and I would say this as an observer of this from a position of privilege, the way that we conceptualize operations in cyberspace tend to be based upon what our own practice has been in the past and how it fits within our own conceptions of warfighting. So for example, if we look at how we've gamed cyber within our war colleges and how it was applied by the Russians during the Russia-Georgia conflict, we see a very, very different set of approaches. Now, 2 years ago, I was privileged to run a workshop that was held at the U.S. Army War College that brought together a number of seniors from across DoD as well as the intelligence community to think through cyberspace from a strategic utility perspective. And there were really three very interesting and prescient takeaways that came away from that. Recall that we're talking about people who have recently revolved through commands in Afghanistan, Iraq, as well as SOCOM, meaning the global command responsible for counterterrorism. So the three key takeaways that this group came up with was as follows. One is they understood cyberspace to be a revolutionary domain. Like the emergence of air during the First World War, it was a domain in which there was little operational practice previously, meaning that it changed things quite considerably. But at the same time, they also recognized it as an evolutionary capability, meaning that the same principles that applied to warfighting, maneuver, and fire also applied within this domain. Secondly, they recognized that there was no going back, that we had become so highly leveraged on the capabilities that we created in cyberspace that the organizations themselves had adapted to those capabilities always being there. So the question was asked during this exercise, if we were to rerun the invasion of D-Day today, could we do it? And the answer was no, because we'd replaced entire staffs with automated processes and dependence on systems that meant we simply did not have the manpower to be able to do that level of planning. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, they recognized that in some instances, cyberspace would become a supported command, not a supporting command. That means that the center of gravity for an action could occur entirely within that domain rather than simply supporting the employment of forces in others. Now, interestingly enough, what that's meant is that cyberspace has become a domain in which anyone can play. The fact that capabilities for operating in cyberspace no longer need to have the kinds of resources available to state or state institutions means, to some extent, that the ability to come up with an international agreement around the employment of these weapons is no longer restricted to the rich club of nations that previously had a monopoly over the use of violence and force because weapon systems are expensive, as are training and institutions to do them. The bottom line is that cyberspace operations are accessible to anyone and everyone and will become probably a feature of warfare anywhere else. They've become essentially democratized. This is one of my favorite pictures from Somalia in recent years. So here you see Al-Shabaab taking pop shots at the UN mission, but behind them, does anyone see what that is? It's a cyber cafe, which tells you a little bit about something, that these things are always there, even in the most austere environments. Let me talk a little bit about Olympic Games and Stuxnet and its implications. So as we've already talked about, Stuxnet was a targeted use of malware against Iran's nuclear program. Specifically, it went after the centrifuges located in Natanz. It was very clever in the sense that it specifically attacked only the centrifuges, and the real innovation was that not only did it physically control the speed at which the centrifuges spun in order to disable them, but it also sent disruptive and deceiving messages to the operators, so the operators didn't know that this was actually happening. What's more important maybe than Stuxnet itself are some of the consequences that came out of it. And Olympic Games is just the real name for it, so I'm leaving it here. So the first thing that Olympic Games brought to bear is that it showed that code is actually being weaponized for offensive operations. In other words, that it's not beyond science fiction to be able to design malware which is specifically used as a weapon system. And I think this is really important because if in physical space, weapons are usually described in terms of their physical properties, in cyberspace, they're described in terms of their legal properties, what they can do once they get on target. And this was, I think, the biggest demonstrative factor of Stuxnet, is that it, in legal and in code terms, was able to distinguish between warhead code, which was meant to have an effect only in a single place, on a single piece of equipment to a significant or specific effect, and what you call propagator code, which means the code that actually gets it there. Because previously, one of the biggest breaks on the employment of cyber weapons, including in 2003 against the telephone exchanges in Baghdad, was unlimited liability. If I use this thing, is it going to affect things outside of the area of operations? What Stuxnet did, literally, is it created code that, like a regular shell that you file from a rifle, had the warhead bit and the shell casing. The shell casing for Stuxnet was found everywhere in the world. But the warhead bit only hit one target and only did one thing. So it created an employable cyber weapon. Now, interestingly enough, as I said, the code behind it was relatively simple. What was sophisticated about Stuxnet was the domain experience required to create that definition between propagator and warhead code. But the reality is that it's now possible. The deployment and employment will take time, as the employment of these systems requires a legal framework rather than a physical capability per se to do that. But the reality is, having had it happen once, that capability is now coming and will be widely employed, and not just by what you might call first world states. Let me very quickly conclude about trends and others, and I realize I'm over time, so I'll be 2 minutes. If the decade of the 1990s and the early 2000s really was about the expansion of cyberspace as a driver for economic development, this present decade is really about focusing on the securing of cyberspace from negative and unpredictable phenomenon which can affect national security and state stability. There is a danger, however, that as we start to focus on securitization, controlling use and users, securitization may put at risk not just the positive benefits that we've seen from networking, but actually start destroying the integrity of cyberspace itself, so it becomes more cantonized and controlled among national and political lines. Some of this is already starting to pass. We're seeing next month a major meeting of the ITU where governance over the space, in other words, the institution makes the rules, will be possibly shifting away from ICANN, which at this point in time is a multi-stakeholder organization, and back to the ITU. The bottom line is that the securitization of cyberspace may create a situation where our freedom of navigation in this space, which we have grown used to, will simply disappear. Now, the danger is that cyberspace as we know it today is a unique man-made domain that emerged largely without the involvement of nation states. It exists as a de facto common area, and that's how we understand it. But as we seek to create these rules to make the space more predictable and reassert state interests in and over this space, we really risk diminishing it or disrupting it in ways that will become inimical to our societies. As we move forward to this, the balance point between security on one hand and freedom on the other hand becomes a really slippery one. Countering terrorism online can become legitimately or silencing legitimate political opposition. Filtering inappropriate content can suddenly become the basis for faith-based filtering that declares as culturally unacceptable anything that challenges the societal status quo. So for example, in Saudi Arabia, if I was a woman and I texted this, a smiley, that would be considered to be haram. Why? Because I'm showing my face. You know, this is Saudi Arabia. This is what I received through my mailbox a few years ago from Bell Canada. Basically, something that tells me, you'll do anything to protect your kids from inappropriate content, so will we. What's the inappropriate content here? Anatomy? The issues are mind-bogglingly complex, and yet we stand really at the precipice of deciding whether the future of the space will be one that continues to act in our favor as an economy, as a political system, or one which will become parceled up into private gardens. For the Canadian government, we need to think about cybersecurity that looks beyond cybersecurity and looks at it in security overall. We need to recognize that preserving openness while balancing security is hugely important, and that requires a whole of government effort, not just something which is ghettoized by mandate into specific agencies. we need to involve the private sector. The reality is that the vast majority of cyberspace is controlled by private state actors, not CSC and not the Government of Canada. We also need to, interestingly enough, work with a coalition of like-minded states, recognizing that the norms of keeping cyberspace open may be just as important as securitizing it in order to defend critical infrastructure. And I think for the military folks in this room, we need to see this space as one for full spectrum operations. We train in every other domain, maneuver and fire, offensive and defensive operations. We should do the same thing in cyberspace. And finally, let me share this one little thought with you. 1937, the American author H.G. Wells prophetically wrote these words. And I agree with them. I mean, he, in some ways, was already foreseeing the emergence of something like cyberspace. But the reality is that the cyberspace that has emerged in the 70 years forward is a much less sophisticated brain. It's an immature brain, a complex brain, similar to that one of an adolescent making his difficult transition into the teenage years. But keeping cyberspace open, I think, is worthy, if difficult, cause. It's difficult and it's challenging because it may force us to get used to a little bit of the friction that this new vital space of human activity makes possible, like cybercrime. But it matters because the alternatives, I would say, risks a return to a much darker human past, one where revolutions can't be tweeted, but must by necessity be belched from the barrel of an AK-47. Thank you for your attention.